After Hours Chapter 2.
The conference room was abuzz with the usual morning chatter as everyone gathered for the weekly meeting. Juno sat quietly at the table, his eyes focused on the agenda in front of him. He was still tired from last night's late work session, but the adrenaline from solving the server crisis had carried him through. He wasn't one to speak up in meetings, especially not when others were in charge of the discussion, but his mind was sharp, even if his body felt drained.
As the meeting continued, one of the senior managers, Greg, launched into a discussion about the project's progress. When he came to the server issues from the previous night, his tone was dismissive. "Honestly, I don't understand why this problem even occurred," Greg said, glancing at the others. "I mean, it's not like we have a shortage of developers here. Someone should have seen it coming, don't you think?"
His words, spoken so casually, sent a ripple of unease through the room. Juno's frown deepened as he took in Greg's casual dismissal. He felt a pang of defensiveness rise within him, but he quickly tamped it down. He usually stayed quiet during these meetings, preferring to let others take the spotlight. But Greg's insensitivity towards their efforts the night before had hit a nerve. Juno glanced briefly at Venetia, noticing the slight tightening of her lips, an indication that she shared his irritation.
Venetia's sharp eyes narrowed, and before anyone could say anything else, she spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Actually, Greg, if I could just clarify," she began, turning to face him directly. "Juno was the one who handled the server issue last night. The problem wasn't as simple as it seemed, and he resolved it under intense pressure. He fixed the system when it could have easily brought everything down. If it weren't for him, we would have faced much bigger problems this morning."
The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Venetia, caught off guard by her unexpected defense. Even Greg looked flustered, his dismissive demeanor faltering. A sense of shocked recognition swept through the room. It wasn't often that Venetia intervened so forcefully, and her words held authority. Juno's cheeks reddened slightly at the unexpected praise, but his chest filled with a mix of gratitude and surprise.
Greg was caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone, but he quickly recovered, giving a nonchalant nod. "Right, well, still, there should have been more oversight."
Venetia held his gaze, her expression unwavering. Juno doesn't need oversight when he's proven time and time again that he can handle these situations. And if you want to be upset about something, I'd suggest looking at the lack of support from the system itself rather than blaming the team. The room fell silent for a moment. No one dared challenge her in that tone. Greg, seeing that he couldn't easily dismiss her point, cleared his throat and moved on to the next topic. But the tension lingered in the air.
Juno, still stunned by Venetia's intervention, stared at her with a mix of gratefulness and admiration. Her defense of him was unexpected, yet it filled him with a sense of validation that he rarely experienced. His heart fluttered subtly at the realization of how highly she regarded his work, and a subtle flutter of hope began to grow within him. Maybe she valued him more than he thought. As the meeting continued, Juno couldn't help but glance at Venetia a few times more, the memory of her words and her unwavering support lingering in his mind.
Later that afternoon, after the meeting had wrapped up, Venetia watched Juno as he quietly sat at his desk, trying to focus on his tasks. The room felt quieter than usual, and she couldn't shake the feeling of how dismissive Greg was about Juno's excellent work ethic. She wanted to check on him, make him understand how valuable he was to her and the company. She approached his desk, leaning casually against the edge, her usual commanding presence tempered by something softer in her expression. "Hey," she said, catching his eye. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay. I know that meeting probably didn't feel great."
Juno looked up from his work, surprise and a slight embarrassment at her approach. He wasn't used to being checked on like this, especially by her. Her softer tone and the genuine concern in her eyes made his heart skip a beat. "Oh," he said, trying to sound casual. "No, I'm fine, just doing my work." He paused, his eyes darting back to the screen to avoid looking at her too directly. "Thanks for what you said earlier. You didn't have to do that."
Venetia smiled, her expression thoughtful. "You deserve it. You've put in the work, and I've seen what you're capable of." She leaned in slightly, her voice softening but carrying a quiet intensity. "Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself, especially not people like Greg. Don't just take it lying down. You're better than that, Juno." Her tone was gentle, yet laced with a firm conviction, as if she wouldn't accept anything less than him believing it.
Her words felt like a physical touch, striking at a place deep within him that he'd kept hidden, the place where he harbored his self-doubts and insecurities. Her conviction, the way she spoke so directly yet kindly, made his chest ache with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a flutter of affection. Thank you, he managed to reply, his voice quiet but earnest. He met her gaze, his hazel eyes earnest and a little stunned. I don't know how you see the potential in me like that, but it means a lot.
Venetia's smile softened, and she placed a hand on the back of his chair in a gesture that felt almost protective. Juno, your work speaks for itself. Just believe in it more and believe in yourself. I do. Her words lingered in the air as she walked away.
Juno's heart raced as her words sank in, her touch leaving a warm imprint on the back of his chair where she had placed her hand. Her firm yet kind confidence in him was almost overwhelming, making him feel seen in a way he wasn't used to. He watched as she walked away, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. Her words echoed in his head, stirring something deep within him, believing in himself. It was easy for her to say, but how could he? No one had ever spoken so highly of him, and her words left him feeling both humbled and confused.
Venetia, for her part, walked away with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She wasn't one to offer compliments lightly, but there was something about Juno that made her feel a protective instinct. He had so much potential, and she wanted to see him step into it. But there was something else too, something more personal. She couldn't quite place it, but she felt the pull of a connection that went beyond the professional. And as the day wore on, she found herself thinking of him more often, wondering just how much more there was to Juno than met the eye.
As the day progressed, Juno struggled to focus on his work, his mind constantly drifting back to Venetia's words. Her confidence in him, her firm yet gentle insistence that he believe in himself, had stirred something within him. He tried to ignore the strange stirring in his stomach at the thought of her, the way his heart raced whenever she spoke to him. But as the hours wore on, it became harder to ignore. Every time she passed by his desk, every time he caught a glimpse of her from the corner of his eye, he felt a pang of something. The office was eerily quiet that late at night. The buzz of the usual workday had long since faded, and only the hum of the computers and the faint click of keyboard keys broke the silence. Juno was still at his desk, focused on entering the final stages of coding for the high-priority project. It was past midnight, and the task at hand was demanding, but it was something he thrived under, solving complex issues, making everything work perfectly.
From across the room, Venetia was sitting at her desk, her laptop open, but her fingers paused mid-air. Her posture, usually so composed and confident, was slumped slightly as she stared at the screen with a furrowed brow. The usual intensity in her gaze was absent, replaced by something softer, more strained.
Juno, immersed in the code, didn't immediately notice Venetia's altered demeanor. It wasn't until he looked up for a brief moment to stretch his neck that he caught a glimpse of her. Her usual upright and focused self was replaced by a somewhat slumped and troubled figure, her expression lacking the usual intensity. Juno's heart gave a little lurch. He paused in his coding, watching her discreetly. It felt out of place, seeing her like this. Concerned, he called out quietly, "Venetia?"
She glanced up, surprised to hear his voice. Her expression softened as she straightened in her chair. "Juno, I didn't realize you were still here."
As Venetia looked up, their eyes met, and Juno felt unexpectedly warm. Her voice was softer than usual, and it sent a flutter through his chest. "Yeah, I lost track of time. This project is a bit demanding." He offered her a small smile, still noticing the weariness in her features. "Are you all right? You seem, I don't know, less—" He fumbled for the right word.
Venetia paused for a moment, her eyes flickering to her screen as if contemplating whether or not to share. She ran a hand through her hair, clearly frustrated. "A deal I was working on fell through. Everything I've been pushing for, it's just all gone to shit."
Juno watched her as she spoke, her usual stern demeanor giving way to vulnerability. His heart ached for her. He could only imagine how hard she must have worked for the deal and how disappointed she must feel. "I'm sorry," he said gently, moving from his desk to stand in front of hers. "I can tell it means a lot to you." He took a hesitant step closer, looking at her directly. "It's not easy when things don't go the way you'd hoped, but I'm sure you did everything you could."
Venetia looked up at him, her gaze flickering with surprise at his words. For a brief moment she didn't know how to respond. It wasn't like her to have someone, let alone Juno, comfort her. She had been so used to handling everything alone, burying her frustration and pushing forward. Something about the sincerity in Juno's voice shifted something inside her. "Thank you for your kind words," she said quietly, her voice tinged with gratitude but also something else. "It's just hard sometimes, you know, always having to keep it together."
Juno nodded, understanding her struggle. He knew how it felt to keep everything bottled up, to have the pressure to always be strong. "I do know," he said quietly. "It can feel exhausting, always having to be the strong one, the one who has it all together." His eyes searched hers, his gaze soft. He wanted to say more, but the words stuck in his throat. The usual shyness had been overtaken by a new confidence that he wasn't used to.
Venetia blinked at him, struck by how much he understood without needing an explanation. It wasn't just the words. There was a calmness to his presence, a quiet strength that was unexpectedly comforting.
Before either of them could say anything further, Juno awkwardly cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Well, if you need a distraction, I could tell you a really bad joke."
Venetia raised an eyebrow, skeptical but amused. "A bad joke? Are you sure that's going to make me feel better?"
Juno gave a lopsided grin. "Well, I never claimed I was a comedian," he said, taking a step closer to her. "But they don't call them dad jokes for nothing." He looked at her for a moment, considering the risk of making a lame joke. Then he shrugged and dove in. "Okay," he began. "What do you call a fake noodle?"
Venetia folded her arms, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I have no idea."
Juno paused for dramatic effect, then delivered the punchline. "An impasta!" He grinned at her, hoping to get some kind of reaction, even if it was just a groan.
Venetia giggled and her eyes lit up for the first time all evening. It was soft, almost like a sigh of relief. "Okay, I take it back. That was bad, but it worked." She shook her head, still smiling at him. "You're full of surprises, Juno. Do you use those dad jokes on your little sister?"
Seeing her reaction, the laughter, the lightness in her eyes, it was worth any amount of embarrassment he felt. He smiled back at her. "Guilty as charged," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I try to save my cringiest material for Emmy." It usually works to get her to roll her eyes.
Venetia's gaze softened even more, and she caught sight of the dimple on Juno's cheek when he smiled. Her expression faltered for a moment, a rare flicker of something that wasn't just professional or distant. "You have a nice smile, you know," she added, her voice low but sincere.
The simple statement caught him completely off guard. It was such a small thing, a passing compliment, but it had his heart racing. The shyness returned, and he found himself blushing under her gaze. "Thanks. He struggled for words, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I don't get compliments often," he admitted, looking at her, surprised at how candid he was being. "You, on the other hand."
"Me what?" she quietly asked, her gaze never wavering from his face.
Juno swallowed, his heart beating faster. He couldn't deny the truth any longer. "Beautiful," he said quietly, holding her gaze. "You're beautiful." The word hung in the air, and in that moment it was all that mattered. Her gray eyes, her soft curves, the confidence that surrounded her. He felt completely lost in her in that tiny office.
Venetia, too, was caught off guard by his unexpected compliment. She felt her cheeks heat up. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she just nodded, grateful but unsure how to process the compliment. The moment lingered, charged with a quiet intimacy neither of them had anticipated. Venetia found herself seeing Juno in a new light, someone not only capable of technical brilliance but also of offering genuine warmth when it was needed most.
They stood there, the silence weighing heavily between them. Juno, too, was surprised by his own honesty. His shyness had vanished, replaced by a strange feeling coursing through him, an undeniable attraction. In the dim light of the office, it seemed like the world had shrunk down to just them. "I should go," he said after a moment, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He lingered a moment longer, his eyes holding hers, before reluctantly turning to head back to his desk.
As she watched him walk away, she bit her bottom lip, trying to steady herself. His compliment lingered in her mind, spoken with such gentle sincerity that it warmed her heart. Forcing her attention back to her laptop, she tried to focus on her work, resisting the urge to steal glances in his direction. Yet, as they continued working side by side, the atmosphere between them subtly shifted, less rigid, more at ease. The moments of vulnerability they had shared that night had planted a seed, one that neither of them would be able to ignore for much longer.
Over the next few days, Juno found himself hyper-aware of Venetia's presence in the office. Every time she walked by, every time he heard her voice, his heart seemed to skip a beat. He tried to keep his focus on his work, on the code he was writing, but it was difficult with so many conflicting emotions coursing through him. There was a part of him that wanted to reach out to her, to talk to her more, but his usual self-doubt held him back, despite having shared a moment of vulnerability with her. He still worried it was one-sided.
The week had been intense, filled with late nights, stressful deadlines, and the pressure of delivering on a high-priority project. But at long last, the project was finished and ready to launch, and the office was buzzing with a sense of accomplishment. To celebrate, the team had gathered at a local bar, the atmosphere casual and lively. Music filled the air, and laughter echoed across the room as colleagues mingled and clinked their glasses together. Venetia, noticing Juno standing alone, couldn't help but sense his discomfort from across the room. It wasn't like him to be so distant, and she knew how hard he'd worked on the project. She excused herself from her group and made her way over to him, weaving through the crowd with an easy confidence that seemed to make the space around her shrink. "Hey, Juno," she called, a soft, knowing smile on her lips as she approached. "I thought I saw a shadow lurking in the corner. Didn't realize it was you."
Juno, so lost in thought, hadn't noticed Venetia approach. He looked up at the sound of her voice, a flicker of surprise giving way to a half-smile. He wasn't used to her initiating conversation with him outside of work, and it had him off balance already. "Oh, hey," he replied, glancing toward the group nearby before meeting her gaze again. "Yeah, not exactly my natural habitat."
Venetia raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at her lips. "Could have fooled me. You pulled off the hardest part of this project. Thought you'd be out there soaking up the compliments." She nudged him lightly, her tone teasing.
Juno chuckled softly, his hand moving to the back of his neck. "I'm better with formulas than crowds." When she gently bumped him, he was struck again by how close she was. How her touch seemed to send a jolt through him. He tried to ignore it, to continue the banter, but it was getting harder to keep his composure.
"Lucky for you, I happen to be an expert at navigating both," Venetia teased, plucking a drink from a passing tray and offering it to him. "Rule number 1, steer clear of small talk. It's mind-numbing."
Juno took the glass, his fingers brushing hers, feeling the faint warmth of her skin linger. As she leaned closer, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper, he couldn't help but notice the way she smelled in the closeness of her body. He took a swig of the drink, trying to steady his nerves. His voice came out a little rougher than he intended. "And here I thought, that's what office parties were made of."
"Only if you're doing it wrong," she said, leaning in just enough to lower her voice. "The trick is to find the snack table. No one questions the guy with a plate in his hand. Instant escape plan."
Juno couldn't help but chuckle at her response. It was both clever and relatable to him. Distraction by carbs. Noted. There was a hint of humor in his voice as the tension in his shoulders started to ease.
"Preferably fried ones." She tilted her head toward the snack table, a playful glint in her eye. "Come on." They both stepped away from the crowd, Venetia walking beside him as they headed toward the table. Food's the best distraction for nerves. And if you get cornered into a conversation, bring up your cooking hobby. "Trust me, people won't see it coming. I didn't," she teased with a smile, casually stealing the onion ring from his hand and popping it into her mouth.
The casual gesture of her taking the onion ring caught him off guard, but he didn't mind. In fact, he found himself enjoying this more relaxed, informal side of her. "You're not stealing my food, are you?" Juno joked, his tone light. He picked up another onion ring, taking a small bite.
"Consider it compensation for saving you from social misery," she quipped, licking a bit of salt from her thumb.
He shook his head, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "I'm surprised you remember that about me," he added, referring to his cooking hobby.
The conversation took on a lighter tone as Venetia chuckled with an arched brow. "What kind of boss would I be if I didn't pay attention?" she teased, a playful glint in her eyes. "Besides, I enjoy our talks, and it's hard to forget someone packing you a home-cooked meal in a deserted office at midnight." Her voice softened just a touch. "No one's done that for me before. It's a core memory now." She smiled softly at him, her expression warm. For once she felt more at ease, the formalities of the office left behind. She was enjoying herself, drinking, talking, and laughing freely, without the usual need to maintain control.
Her words hung in the air, and Juno felt a wave of heat spread from his chest to his cheeks. The fact that she remembered that night and how he'd cooked for her was both a surprise and a source of pride. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," he managed to reply, his voice soft. I enjoy the nights where it's just the two of us in the office, working side by side." He took another bite of the onion ring, his gaze floating between her face and the food he was holding.
For a moment she held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then a small, crooked smile curved her lips. "Me too," she murmured, almost to herself. As they stood by the snack table, she watched him out of the corner of her eye, noting how comfortable he seemed, becoming a little more animated as the conversation flowed. His earlier awkwardness had faded, and now he was giving her glimpses of his humor and intelligence outside of the work setting. "You know," Venetia nudged him lightly, her voice carrying a teasing warmth, "you're not as bad at this as you think. I don't think I've ever seen you laugh like this before."
Juno chuckled at her teasing, a flush of embarrassment spreading across his cheeks. He'd been so engrossed in the conversation, so focused on her, that he hadn't noticed his own walls coming down. The realization only made him blush harder. "I don't know about that," he said, fidgeting slightly. "Maybe it's just because talking to you." He ducked his head, taking another bite of an onion ring to cover his sudden self-consciousness.
Venetia's smile lingered as she met his eyes. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her pause, something vulnerable, yet genuine. It was rare for anyone to drop their defenses with her, especially at work, but Juno had a quiet sincerity about him that made her curious. "You keep surprising me, you know," she said softly, her voice losing some of its teasing edge.
His heart skipped a beat at her words. Despite her confidence and authority at work, there were times like this, moments where he could see past the surface, and he saw a different side of her, a more vulnerable side. He shifted his weight slightly, turning to face her more directly. He started, his voice unusually quiet. "You surprise me a lot, too."
Venetia chuckled, her gaze softening even further. There was something magnetic about him, something beyond his technical skill. It was his quiet depth, the way he carried himself even when he didn't think anyone was watching. Seeing Juno outside of the workplace dynamic made her realize just how much she admired his quiet strength. There was something about the way he interacted with her that made her feel seen, and that was rare. As the night wore on, they spent more time talking, joking, and getting to know each other in a way that didn't involve spreadsheets or deadlines. Venetia, despite her usual self-assurance, felt a sense of comfort in Juno's steady presence, his quiet attentiveness contrasting with the usual noise around them.
Juno found himself relaxing more and more as the night went on. Being with Venetia didn't feel like work, it felt good. The conversation was light, easy, a comfortable back and forth that he hadn't experienced with anyone in a long time. He found himself laughing more, sharing stories, and simply enjoying her company, not as his boss, but as a person. His usual shyness faded under the warmth of her presence, and for a brief moment there was no stress, no pressure, no code to untangle. Just them, simply existing.
As the work party at the bar ended and both prepared to leave, Venetia gave him a playful smile. "Same time next project?" she asked with a wink. The connection between them, though still unspoken, had deepened.
Juno couldn't help but return her smile, the light-hearted banter still lingering in the air. Her wink seemed to send a flutter through his chest. "Sure," he replied, a hint of confidence in his voice that wasn't there hours ago. "I guess we're a good team after all." He held her gaze for a moment, wishing they didn't have to part ways yet.
As they said their goodbyes outside the bar before heading into the night, both knew that something had shifted. Something worth exploring. The meeting had gone later than expected. Venetia was exhausted, her mind still processing the strategies and decisions they had just discussed. But the moment she stepped out of the building, it was clear that the evening was about to take a turn. The sky, once clear, was now an ominous shade of gray, and within moments the rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Venetia didn't have an umbrella. She never did, not with the unpredictable weather these days. And with no one else left in the office, she made her way to her car, hoping the rain would pass. But when she tried to turn the key, the engine sputtered and died. Her eyes narrowed in frustration as she tried again, but the car refused to start. She groaned, a soft exhale of annoyance escaping her. Of course, it had to be tonight, of all nights. There was no one else to call, her phone had died, and she hadn't been able to grab her charger in the office. Just as she leaned back in her seat, trying to gather her thoughts, a familiar figure appeared through the downpour.
Juno, the last to leave the office and the first to notice Venetia's distress, felt a pang of worry seeing her struggling to start her car. When he saw her frustrated expression through the rain-streaked windows, he quickly realized there was no time for debate. Making a split-second decision, he stepped out of his car and made his way to Venetia's. Rapping firmly on the window, he waited patiently for her to roll it down. The rain was heavy around them, the sound of droplets pinging on metal adding to the tension.
She looked up, surprised to see him standing by her car window, his hair soaked. "Car's dead and I didn't bring an umbrella. Just my luck," she said. Her voice clipped as she wiped a few droplets from her forehead, clearly frustrated with the situation.
Juno gave a sympathetic wince, his concern for her clear in his eyes. "Looks like the rain caught you off guard," he remarked, his voice carrying over the pounding rain. He looked around them, taking in the darkened parking lot. Everyone had left for the day. It was just the two of them. "Looks like you're stuck for the time being. Can I give you a ride home?" he offered.
Venetia, caught off guard by his offer, blinked in surprise. She opened her mouth to protest, but there was something in his earnestness that made her pause. Despite their professional relationship, she realized it was a simple, thoughtful offer. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice softening.
Juno nodded, a reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of silver around them. "Of course," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the rain. "I can't leave you stranded here, especially in this weather." He took a step back, gesturing to his own car. "Come on, before you get drenched."
Venetia gave him a small smile in return, feeling a wave of appreciation. "Thanks, Juno. I'll owe you one." The two of them hurried to his car, the sound of the rain growing louder as they climbed inside. The interior of his car was warm, the faint scent of leather and something faintly citrusy filling the air.
Juno turned the key, and the engine purred to life, the soft hum of the car making the tension of the evening start to melt away. They both settled in, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence. Juno focused on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly as he tried to ignore the unfamiliar closeness.
The confined space of the car made everything feel more intimate, and Venetia, though trying to remain calm, felt the same strange energy in the air. "So," she said, breaking the silence, her voice light as she turned to glance at him. "How's the new project going?"
Juno felt the tension between them grow as they settled into the compact space of the car. The rain outside continued to thrum against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound and isolation. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Her question about the project shattered the silence, and he latched onto it like a lifeline, grateful for something to talk about. "It's going well," he replied, his voice slightly strained. "We've got a lot of work ahead, but I think we're on the right track."
Venetia's eyes softened as she studied him. "I'm glad to hear that. You've been doing a great job, Juno. I know I don't say it enough, but I appreciate your work."
Juno felt his cheeks flush, the unexpected compliment hitting him harder than he expected. He'd grown used to her authority and professionalism, but this softer, gentler side, coming from her, made him feel vulnerable yet oddly pleased. "Thank you," he murmured, his grip on the steering wheel loosening slightly. "That means a lot, coming from you."
There was a moment of silence between them, the only sound the rain splattering against the windshield. Then Venetia leaned back in her seat, letting out a small sigh.
Juno glanced at her for a moment, noticing the way she leaned back into the seat, the weariness in her sigh. The rain continued to fall around them, a steady, rhythmic beat on the roof. "You look tired," he murmured, concern in his voice. "Long day?"
"You could say that," Venetia replied with a small smile, her eyes softening. "The client wasn't happy with the project's progress, so I got an earful during the meeting. Then we spent a lot of time redrafting and, well, to put it plainly, I'm not handling it very well. I'm not used to failing."
Juno's eyes narrowed in understanding, a small frown creasing his forehead. "You don't fail, Venetia," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You push until you find a solution. It's one of the things we all admire about you." He kept his eyes on the road, the rain making it harder to see. The wipers swiped back and forth, clearing the windshield for brief moments.
Venetia turned to look at him, her expression softened by his unexpected words. She smiled a bit wistfully. "Thanks, Juno. I needed to hear that more than I realized."
The sincerity in her tone and the way she looked at him made his heart skip a beat. The rain suddenly seemed less intense as he focused on her. "You're more than just our boss, you know," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. You're brilliant, and we're lucky to have you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment there was an undeniable closeness. As Juno drove, his mind kept racing. He had never expected to see this side of Venetia. The confident, commanding woman he knew had cracked, just slightly, revealing something more fragile, more human. Before either of them could say anything further, Juno reached into the back seat and pulled out a small towel. He handed it to her with a slight nervousness, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment.
Venetia froze for a second, feeling the warmth of his hand linger on hers even after he'd pulled away. She looked at the towel, then back at him, her heart racing, her gaze lingering a little too long.
The simple gesture of handing her the towel felt intensely intimate, the brief brush of their fingers sending a spark through them both. Juno could feel his heart hammering in his chest and knew, without a doubt, that she was feeling the same strange energy. The atmosphere in the car was thick with unspoken words and suppressed glances. Juno's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, trying to maintain some semblance of control. The rain around them still beat against the car, a constant reminder of the storm outside and the one brewing inside.
"Thanks," Venetia murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She held the towel, feeling its softness under her fingertips, but her thoughts had long drifted from the rain. Juno's proximity, his quiet kindness, it all felt too personal, too intimate. Forcing herself to focus, she began drying her hair, her breath shallow and measured. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed his grip on the wheel, the whiteness of his knuckles revealing a silent but potent tension. Holding the towel with deliberate care, she placed it on her lap, the action more of a distraction than anything else. The silence stretched between them once more, but this time, it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. In the small enclosed space, the air seemed to hum with an unspoken energy, something that went beyond work or their project. It felt personal. Venetia had always prided herself on staying in control, but in this simple, quiet moment, something inside her began to shift. Juno's empathy and his quiet strength made her see him as more than just a subordinate. He was someone she could rely on.
Juno felt her gaze on him, the weight of it sending a thrill down his spine. He focused on the road, trying to ignore the way his heart was racing. He knew he had to say something, to fill the silence, but the words stuck in his throat. The interior of the car felt smaller, more intimate, as if the rain outside had trapped them in a bubble. There was a connection between them, born of shared work, and now, this unexpected closeness. He risked a glance at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, electric moment.
Venetia sat quietly in the passenger seat of Juno's car, but her eyes never left his face as she delved into a deep thought. She felt the tension between them, the unspoken pull that had been growing over the past few weeks, and tonight it felt more palpable than ever. Juno's earlier words, his quiet support, his honesty, had struck a chord in her. She wasn't used to people seeing through the polished exterior she wore so carefully, but with Juno it was different. He had seen the cracks, however small they were, and his sincerity had disarmed her in a way few people could. But now, with the silence hanging thick between them, she found herself wanting to say something, anything. To break it, to address the growing tension, even if it was unspoken. "Juno," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though testing the waters. She turned toward him, meeting his eyes for a moment before quickly glancing away. "I've been meaning to say something."
Juno's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his name on her lips. He'd been lost in his own thoughts, trying to steady his racing heart, but the sound of her voice pulled him back to reality. As their eyes met, he could see the uncertainty and vulnerability in hers. "What is it?" he asked quietly, his voice low and measured. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he prepared himself for whatever she was going to say.
She hesitated, then spoke, her voice laced with a quiet intensity. "I've noticed something about you. You're not like the others. You're not trying to impress anyone, not pretending to be something you are not. You're real, and I admire that more than I think I've let on."
Juno's breath hitched in his throat, the words sinking in like a warm balm. Never had he expected her to say something like that about him. He was used to her professional, somewhat reserved demeanor, not this vulnerability. "You notice me?" he asked, surprised. Despite all the times they'd spent together, he'd assumed he was invisible to her, just another colleague, someone in the background, not worthy of her attention.
Venetia interrupted him gently, her voice soft but firm. We've been dancing around this unspoken tension between us for a while, haven't we?
Juno visibly tensed in his seat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He knew it was true, that they had been tiptoeing around something that was getting harder and harder to ignore. But hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. Yes, he admitted quietly, the word barely above a whisper. He could feel his heart rate quicken, his stomach coiling in a nervous knot.
I know I'm your boss, Venetia said, her voice tinged with something vulnerable. And that's part of what makes this hard. But it doesn't change the fact that I see you, Juno. I see what you're capable of, what you bring to the table. And lately, I've been wondering if there's more to you than I've let myself admit. The words hung in the air between them, charged with the weight of everything unsaid.
Juno couldn't hide the surprise in his expression, his eyes flashing towards her for a brief moment before returning to the road. Her words sent a flutter of heat through him, the idea that she might see him as something more than an employee, something he'd barely dared to hope for. He swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. And, he asked quietly, almost afraid of the response, "What have you been wondering?"
Venetia paused for a moment, weighing her words carefully. The rain seemed to pick up in intensity, but it was as if the world outside faded away, leaving just the two of them in this small, intimate bubble. "Do you feel the same way?" she asked, her voice quiet yet direct, her gaze never leaving his face. About everything. About us. I've been thinking about it, Juno, and I don't want to keep pretending like I don't feel this tension between us. I know the age difference, the work dynamic. There's a lot holding us back. But I need to know honestly. Do you feel the same way I do?
He took a deep breath, the weight of her question settling heavily on him. The rain beat harder against the windows, the world outside feeling distant and muted. "Yes," he admitted softly, his voice wavering but sincere. "I feel it too. I've tried to ignore it, to pretend it's not there, but..." His hands moved restlessly against the steering wheel, his fingers drumming against the smooth leather. "The age difference, work, the dynamics, they're real factors," he continued, the admission difficult but necessary. "But it doesn't change how I feel about you."
The words hung between them, the silence stretching in a way that felt almost sacred. For a long moment, Venetia didn't say anything. She just watched him, letting his confession settle in her chest. "I've been feeling the same way," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper though her eyes were steady. "And I've been trying to convince myself it's just the work, the stress, or maybe even my own fear of letting someone in. But I can't keep denying what I'm feeling, Juno. I've grown fond of you, more than I should have allowed myself." She turned her gaze back to the rain, her thoughts swirling in her head. The confession hung in the air, thick with possibility. Yet, her own insecurities rose to the surface, the age difference, the power dynamic, the complexities of their roles at work. Was it worth the risk? But as she stole a glance at him, she saw the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time she allowed herself to fully embrace what was happening between them. "Are we crazy for this?" Venetia asked, her voice soft, the question laced with both hesitation and longing.
The tension in the air crackled like static as the reality of their situation sank in. Juno swallowed hard, his mind racing with 100 concerns, but his heart overruling them all. "Maybe we are," he admitted quietly, his voice raw and honest. "But..." He flicked his gaze to her, a small, nervous smile pulling at his lips. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" Despite the storm outside, the rain pelting the car, inside, he felt an odd sense of peace, even as his heart thundered in his chest.
The car came to a smooth stop in front of Venetia's apartment building, the sound of rain tapping gently on the windows filling the silence between them. The air inside the car was thick, charged with the weight of everything they had just said, and neither of them moved right away. Juno's hands rested on the steering wheel, his fingers still trembling ever so slightly from the intensity of their conversation. Venetia didn't hesitate. Her gaze never left his, and there was a quiet determination in her eyes. Without saying a word, she reached out and gently took his hand in hers, her fingers warm against his skin. The simple touch felt like it spoke volumes, her unspoken invitation, her silent challenge, her openness.
Juno's breath caught in his throat as she gently took his hand in hers, her touch sending a shiver down his spine. The feel of her fingers against his, the warmth of her skin against his, sent a jolt of electricity through him. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand in hers, palm up, their fingers wrapping delicately around one another. "Venetia," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, unasked but implicit in the way he looked at her, holding her gaze in the dim interior of the car.
She locked eyes with him, and in that moment, everything else in the world faded away. The tension between them had been building for so long, and now it seemed to come to a head in this single, fragile moment. "Just tell me to stop if you don't want the same thing," Venetia said, her voice low but steady. Her words hung in the air, laced with both vulnerability and certainty. Her gaze drifted to his lips, her breath catching slightly as she leaned toward him, the space between them narrowing. The soft flicker of a smile played at the corner of her lips, but her eyes held a quiet intensity, a mixture of anticipation and something deeper that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now.
Juno's heart hammered against his chest, the air around them crackling with an electric energy. As she leaned closer, the space between them growing smaller, his mind raced with a chorus of doubts and what-ifs, but they were quickly drowned out by the growing desire to see where this journey would lead them. He swallowed, his throat dry, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook his head. "I don't want you to stop," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want this."
Venetia's fingers lightly traced the back of his hand, her thumb brushing over his skin as she smiled softly. "Good," she replied, her voice low, her eyes glimmering. The distance closed between them, their lips meeting in a gentle, tentative kiss. The world outside ceased to matter, as everything inside the car felt like it was folding into this one perfect moment.
The touch of her fingers against his skin sent a shiver of pleasure down his spine, and when her lips finally met his, it was like a dam breaking. All the pent-up desire and longing over the past weeks, months even, came rushing forward, a torrent of emotions he'd never fully let himself feel. He responded slowly at first, the unfamiliar touch and taste of her, the heat of their breath mingling, sending a jolt of electricity through him. But it didn't take long for the hesitance to melt away, replaced by a growing hunger, a need to be closer to her.
Venetia's voice was soft, almost like a whisper, as she pulled away from the kiss. Her fingers still lingered in his hand. "Do you want to come in for a bit?" she asked, her words trailing off as she hesitated, a hint of uncertainty in her tone. "To wait for the rain to stop?" Her attempt at an excuse was poor at best, but the invitation was clear. She wasn't ready to let the night end just yet, not when everything had shifted, not when the space between them felt so electric and so real.
Juno was silent for only a moment, his gaze firmly fixed on her, his breathing ragged from the kiss. The invitation was clear, the heat still crackling between them, and he was powerless to resist it. "Yes," he said quietly, the single word carrying all his need, all his desire, all the months of longing he'd tried to ignore. I'd like that." He reached out, his fingers closing over hers in a gentle grasp, silently asking for her guidance. The rain still drummed lightly on the windows, but for a moment, it felt like the storm had passed inside the car, leaving only the quiet hum of anticipation.
Venetia's pulse quickened as she opened the door and stepped out into the rain, Juno following close behind. The night air was cool against her skin, but the warmth of what had just happened, what was now beginning to unfold between them, kept her from shivering. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, feel free to visit my Patreon for more content.